Hello everybody, my name is Seth Bramson and I am happily ensconced here with my bride in Miami Shores, and we have lived in Greater Miami for a long time. I like to say I'm a newbie, but I guess 73 years living in Dade County doesn't make me a newbie anymore. After 35 years on Miami Beach, we moved to Miami Shores in December of '81. And I am the senior collector in America of Florida East Coast Railway, Florida Transportation memorabilia, Miami memorabilia, and Floridiana. I'm particularly blessed not only to be living here in Miami Shores, but to be married to the same woman come November for 44 years. And on top of that, oh, by the way, I chased that woman for 3 years until she caught me. On top of that, though, I'm extra blessed because I am at Barry University. I have been at Barry in some teaching capacity or another, graduate, undergraduate, adult and continuing ed. Right now I am adjunct professor of history and historian in residence at that great school. So it's really been a wonderful ride. I expect it to continue for a long time. Well, you're not here to learn about me, you're here to learn about the history of women here in Dade County, or Miami-Dade County. And in order to understand that, we want to recognize that really our history regarding women begins with the Native Americans. And I say the Native Americans because prior to the named tribes that are here today, the Seminole and the Miccosukee, we had the Timucuans, we had the Calusa, and we had the Tequesta. Now, do we call them tribes? We don't know, because we have named these groups of Native Americans. And it would be the same thing as if we were to go to, let's say, Alpha Centauri, or to Venus, or there's not going to be a sign that says welcome to Mars. We've given these names artificially. Well, except for the Seminole and the Miccosukee, that's what we have done with these other groups of Native Americans. We've given them names artificially so that we can identify them. The women were major participants in everything that those groups of Native Americans did, as they are with the Seminole and the Miccosukee. If we move forward through time, though, we find that women were very involved in the very early history. And we may have heard of something called the English grant, which had nothing to do with Great Britain. There were women involved in the early grants of land that came down from the Spanish kings. But eventually, we do find out that prior to 1878, William and Mary Brickell moved to Dade County. Now understand that Dade County at that time started from where it starts today and went all the way north to north of Jupiter in what today is Palm Beach County. Palm Beach County was carved out in 1909, Broward County in 1915. Dade County still remains huge with 2,200 square miles. So it's no slouch in terms of size. Why is that important? Because so many women have been so important. And we want to begin then with the fact that in the Bramson Archive, which is the largest private collection, private as opposed to museums, of Miami memorabilia and Floridiana in America, we have the oldest known marked Miami pieces, marked Miami and Dade County pieces. The 1823 hand-drawn abstract of the 94,600 acres of Miami, the oldest known marked piece of Miami memorabilia. And we have the 1878 Dade County Revenue Collector's Book. What was a revenue collector? The tax collector. And there were about 36 families living in all of Dade County at the time, and the total tax collection was about $3,200. Why is that important? Because we see some names that are important. We see the Brickell name, Mary and William Brickell. We see the Sturtevant name, Who were the Sturtevants? The Sturtevants were Julia Tuttle's parents. Julia Tuttle was not here yet, but her parents were. And so what we begin to learn is that, yes, for better or for worse, for many years, certain people have referred to Julia Tuttle as the mother of Miami. But wait a minute, that's not fair, because there was more than one mother of Miami. Now, indeed, Julia Tuttle was certainly very important to the point that a book was written about Julia and the women who followed, the great women who followed. But wait a minute, it wasn't just Julia Tuttle, because Mary Brickell is equally as important. And I want to have all of our viewers understand that, yes, certainly Julia Tuttle was very important. And we all know the orange blossom fable. So, ladies and gentlemen, viewers, we're going to debunk the orange blossom fable. Now, I debunked that fable beginning as early somewhere around 1978. And when I did it, Juanita Green was the first female assistant editor of the Miami Herald. Another great name in women's history in Dade County. And after I debunked it, and I don't know if it was a letter to the editor of the Herald, whatever it was, I got a letter from Ms. Green. And she said, "Oh, this is terrible. You're a revisionist historian." And I wrote her back and I said, "Absolutely not." I said, a revisionist historian is somebody who makes up stories to suit him or herself. We know that very well. But you have to understand that over the years, new facts and new information come to the fore. After all, how do we find cures for diseases? Because research, new information. And so indeed, over the years, we come to learn that no, Julia Tuttle did not send Mr. Flagler any orange blossoms. The story, in fact, begins years before that. And what occurred was that William and Mary Brickell, they, long before Julia Tuttle did the same thing, they offered Henry Flagler half of their holdings south of the Miami River if he would extend his railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay. He was not interested. Now, years go by, Julia Tuttle and her family moved down to be with her parents, and indeed, eventually, she makes the offer. The problem is that I want to be careful with my wording, certain people who want to think of themselves as historians but will not face facts. Oh yes, Julia, yeah, but wait a minute, what about the Brickells? What about the Brickels? And so, indeed, yes, she did offer Mr. Flagler land. So now we start to think about this whole story. She offered Mr. Flagler land, and he said, "No, I'm not interested. I'm not interested." But she and the Brickells had been writing to the great Henry Plant, Mr. Flagler's contemporary on the west coast of Florida. And they had been pleading with Mr. Plant to extend his railroad from the west coast over to Miami, what would become Miami. And with each letter, he would say, "No, I'm not interested. There's no reason to." And finally, he wrote back to either Mrs. Brickell or Mrs. Tuttle, and he said, "Madam, you will kindly stop communicating with me. I have no intention of extending my railroad 160 miles through trackless wilderness to satisfy your ego. Very truly yours, Henry Bradley Plant." Well, they were not upset in the least, because they knew that their salvation was 65 miles north, because the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Indian River Railway had reached West Palm Beach. And so both of them began writing Mr. Flagler. Eventually, December of 1894 and January and February of 1895, we had the great and terrible freezes, which destroyed the crops throughout Florida. In fact, it was those freezes that were the impetus for a fellow whose name you might have heard of, by the name of William Burdine, to decide that he was going to leave Bartow and come over to this new place called Miami, which he did in 1898. But at any rate, now, the freezes. And yes, it is true. Julia Tuttle sent Mr. Flagler a telegram. And the telegram said, region around shores of Biscayne Bay untouched by freezes. Please come and see. Contrary to what you may have heard, he did not come and see. He sent his two now famous in Florida lieutenants, James Ingram, for whom the Ingram building in downtown Miami is named, and Joseph R. Parrott, his railroad vice president. He said, I want you to go down there. He said, I cannot believe that with the whole state in a state of terrible, the truck, the produce, the citrus, everything is dying and dead. I can't believe that this one area is untouched. Well, they came down to West Palm Beach from St. Augustine by train. They got off the train. They were met by a buckboard, taken down. They got on a boat. We're not sure exactly where, but that boat brought them down into a little place that today is called Little Haiti, but was then called Lemon City, because that's where the only usable dock was. And they were met in Lemon City with a buckboard, and their porters were with them, and they were brought down to what today is called downtown Miami. At that time, it was nothing but wilderness. And they are stunned. They can't believe it. They came through all of this terrible devastation, everything dying, fruit and vegetables dying on the vine, falling off the trees in front of them. And here it is, magnificent, verdant and lush and green. And they are stunned. And they are greeted not just by Julia Tuttle, but by Mary and William Brickell and the other people who were here at the time. And it was very interesting because Julia Tuttle did not give Mr. Flagler any orange blossoms. Now, viewers, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about this. You've heard the story. Oh, Julia Tuttle gave Mr. Flagler some orange blossoms, or sent Mr. Flagler some orange blossoms. Well, wait a minute. How did she send them to him in St. Augustine? FedEx overnight? UPS overnight? Now, I want you to think about this. What happened was Mr. Ingram and Mr. Parrott reported back to Mr. Flagler. Yes, it's true. And what did they bring him? They brought him several boxes of produce. They brought him 2 citrus tree limbs wrapped in wet cotton. We don't know whether they were lemon, lime, orange, tangerine. We don't know which citrus fruit it was. We just know that they brought back 2 citrus tree limbs. He, Mr. Flagler, said to Mr. Ingram and Mr. Parrott, gentlemen, are you sure? Are you certain? And they said, sir, you sent us down there to report back to you. We are reporting back to you what we saw. Mr. Flagler then sends his famous telegram to Mrs. Tuttle. Madam, what is it that you propose? And that's when she wrote back the famous letter. But here is where we have to pay attention. In that letter, of course, she wrote that if you will, my dear Mr. Flagler, if you will extend your railroad to the shores of Biscayne Bay and build one of your great hotels, then in addition to the lands already promised you by Mr. and Mrs. Brickell, I will give you half of my holdings north of the river, that referring to the Miami River, of course, and 50 acres for shops and yards. And with that, an agreement was reached, the contracts were drawn up, they were signed by all parties, and all parties were true to their words. Now, obviously, with weather like that, and any of you who have lived here for a goodly time know that we get rainstorms, and some of you have probably seen the rain comes right, and all of a sudden it stops, and then it goes back, and across the street there's not a drop of rain. Well, it was like that with the freezes. In all my years of collecting, and I ask you to keep in mind that, yes, I am the senior collector. I'm collecting all this junk longer than anybody in America. This past May started my 63rd year of collecting Florida East Coast Railway, Florida Transportation memorabilia, Miami memorabilia, and Floridiana. But it appears, now notice I'm being careful, I'm giving you a disclaimer. It appears that the freeze line, it appears, was somewhere, now notice it's a pretty good spread, somewhere between a mile north and a mile south of